What I'm sharing is our today's lesson on a blank page. We are going to do the concept of what we call market equilibrium. And this is a subtopic that is going to bring in two different topics, which we have already covered. One is a demand analysis, and the other one is a supply analysis. So it's going to combine these two in relation to the establishment of the equilibrium for the commodity in the market. So what is market equilibrium by definition? I would say that equilibrium would mean a state of balance or a state of rest, into which now applying that concept to the market for a commodity, it would actually mean a state in which that market for that commodity is at a rest or at a balance in which there is no disturbance. We say demand and supply forces are actually equal. And therefore, at that position, both the consumer and the supply of the commodity are satisfied with the price prevailing, as well as the quantity offered and of course demanded in the market at that particular time, because we normally say price keeps on changing with a change in terms of time, where time being an independent variable, it does influence so many other things to actually experience a change in the market. So this concept of equilibrium can actually be illustrated on a graph. We have dealt with the price as a major factor affecting both demand and supply of a commodity in the market. And we went ahead and demonstrated how to come up with a normal demand curve, avoiding such exceptional cases, whichever we talked about. And of course, the supply curve, again, minus the cases that do violate the law of what? Of supply. So on a graphical representation, would assume a normal case in the market for a commodity. Where we are going to represent demand and supply curves plotted on the same graph. So still price on the Y to be plotted against the quantity presented on the x-axis. Under normal circumstances, when I say normal circumstances, we are avoiding those exceptional cases. A demand curve, assuming normal case in the market, we said it does slope from left to right downwards. A normal supply curve would slope from left to right upwards. Okay, at the point of intersection, and these are not necessarily straight lines, it depends on the change happening on supply or even demand with a change in the price of the commodity. At the point of intersection, we label what we call the equilibrium point or position. And the price prevailing in the market for the commodity at that time, we call it the equilibrium price. In short, the P. Equilibrium price. The quantity demanded and supplied, which is actually the same, is called the equilibrium quantity. In short, the QE. I repeat, under normal circumstances, sorry for that. Under normal circumstances, the demand curve would slope downwards, the supply curve would slope upwards. At the point of intersection between these two curves represented on the same graph, we have the equilibrium point, also known as the equilibrium position. The prevailing market price for the commodity, we call it the equilibrium price, and the quantity demanded and supplied, we call it the equilibrium quantity. We can abbreviate that one as the QE. This is a situation where we are saying the market is in equilibrium, where demand and supply are equal. The condition for equilibrium, at equilibrium point, as to evaluate the equilibrium point of a commodity, what is the condition? The condition for equilibrium is that demand for the commodity must always equate to supply. And therefore, one should be able now to come up with the equilibrium price as well as the equilibrium quantity. And at this point, we say both the economic forces, the demand and supply economic forces. When we talk of economic forces, we're talking of the excess demand and excess supply. We say at this point of equilibrium, they are actually at least, they are the same. No force is more than the other in the market for the commodity. If the commodity is not in equilibrium in the market, we'll talk about the disequilibrium, and we'll see why a disequilibrium would be experienced in the market for a commodity. So, assuming we have some data provided here, we've got some table here with the price per unit, we should say in shillings. We have the quantity demanded. And here we have the quantity supplied. And we want to come up with the equilibrium for the commodity in the market. So at a price of shillings 10 per unit, let's say the quantity demanded here is around 50 units. At a price of say 18 shillings, of course you'd expect a decline in the quantity. Let's assume 44 units. At a price of say shillings 20, the quantity demanded here could be around 35 units. Let's assume at a price of shillings 24, the quantity demanded here could be about 30 units. Then as the price increases, we'd expect an increase in the quantity supplied. Let's say we have an amount of 25 units supplied at a price of shillings 10 per unit. When the price increases to shillings 18, let's assume we are supplying around 38 units. The price of shillings 20, 45 units are supplied, and maybe at a price of shillings 24 per unit, we have, say, 55 units supplied in the market for the commodity. This is the data provided, and you're asked to come up with the equilibrium for this commodity in the market. How do you go about that? On a Cartesian plane, you choose some space where you're going to represent both the demand and the supply curve. Remember, on the same graph, quantity still plotted on the X, price should be plotted on the Y. You can see my graphical representation. Label your axis, and of course here you're going to have a small title, a graph representing the market equilibrium. If this was a commodity quoted, say X or any other, again you give the title accommodating the name of that commodity. The smallest price that I see in my data is shillings 10, a range of 10 would do, or you can provide a small allowance, for example, and then you can start at around 10. Maybe you go for a range of 5, because of 18 there, 15, maybe 20, and 25. $10, maybe 15 there, around 20. Since the highest is 24, we can go up to 25. That will be enough. You try and spread your work to cover about 3/4 of your space. On the quantity, the smallest amount, both the demand and supply, the lowest quantity is at 25 units. Again, you can allow for a small difference before you choose on your scale. You can start at around 20 or even 25, it's okay. I'll start at 20, maybe 25, 30, 35, the highest is 55, which you can have it as we mark the end of our scale there, accommodating all the quantities that we have in our data. So we can start by plotting the quantity demanded against the price. You can do one at a time, don't mix. The price of shillings 10, we have an amount of 50 units, somewhere there. Price of shillings 18, slightly higher than 15. We have 44 units, slightly less than 45, somewhere here. At a price of shillings 20, we have an amount of 35 units, somewhere here. Come and plot that. And lastly, at a price of shillings 24, we have 30 units. Again, you come and do your plotting there. Of course, this is not a straight line. you join your protein points using freehand. Try and smoothen the curve. You join your protein points. And then, of course, to correct a demand curve, we need to have some DDs at the extreme ends. As you can see, this is a normal case conforming to the law of demand. Our curve is sloping downwards. Then we represent the supply curve at a price of shillings 10. We have 25 units. Some are here. At a price of shillings 18, we have 38 units. Some are here. You come and represent that, 38 units, some are here. At a price of shillings 20, we have 45 units. And then at a price of shillings 24, we have 55 units. Somewhere here, you come into your protein. Then of course, again, this is not a straight line. If it's a straight line, use a ruler to join your points. If not, you smoothen the curve using freehand. So there it goes. We have the supply curve, of course, sloping downwards from right to left, or you can say sloping upwards from left to right. At the point of intersection, you label your equilibrium point. At the point of intersection, you have the equilibrium point. The one I've marked with the pink color, you can see that. Then you use a ruler to drop a perpendicular line to touch the x-axis. To touch the x-axis, it's slightly less than 40, slightly less than 40, and approximate a price of shillings. How much? Let's see on the y-axis. This is slightly less than 20, at around shillings 19, because this was around 18 that we were plotting, which is slightly higher this one now. Can approximate the price of shillings 19 there with an amount of around 39 units. Since you're doing graphical representation, estimates are around in that case. We may not get all of us the same result. It will depend on your accuracy. Again, as you can see, I've deviated a little bit when I was trying to estimate the price as well as the quantity. Use a ruler to join to the X and also to the Y axis, so that you'll be able to come up with a better estimate or a more accurate estimate. So this is one way into which we can represent the equilibrium of a commodity in the market when some quantities, say on the demand and the supply, are related to the price. That is by graphical representation. At the point of equilibrium, where we have the condition for demand and supply being the same, you identify both the equilibrium price and also the equilibrium quantity. So if given a problem and you're asked about the equilibrium for a commodity, make sure you identify the equilibrium price and also the equilibrium quantity. In some instances, we talked about, if you remember, the linear functions taking care of both the demand and also supply. So if our commodity has both the linear demand and supply functions given, is it possible to come up with the demand curve, or rather the demand curve and supply curve, to identify the equilibrium point, so the equilibrium price and the quantity for the commodity? Or can we have some calculations, say, to identify the equilibrium price and also the equilibrium quantity? That is possible given the linear demand and also a supply functions. So to represent that, we'll be guided by an illustration or an example. So let's see from linear functions how we can identify the equilibrium price and the quantity for the commodity in the market. So again, I'm sharing on my screen. So let's say for a commodity, say X, its demand and supply functions are given as follows. Okay. So I'll start with the quantity given by the function 20, say minus P, and I'll also have another linear function again. I'll call it quantity as a function of price given by this equation minus 15 plus 3P. So I want us to start from an angle where we are the ones to identify which one defines a demand and which one defines a supply. In our last class, we said what? Whenever I'm given a function of the quantity related to the price, if it's to be called demand function, then I should see a negative relationship between these two variables. Quantity and price are negatively related. This is what I can now call the quantity demanded as a function of the price, okay? If we have a relationship between these two variables, the quantity and the price, and that they are showing a positive relationship, you can see this sign here being positive. It shows a positive relationship between the quantity and the price. Therefore, we can define this one to be a supply function. I repeat, demand and price are supposed to be negatively related. Supply and price are supposed to be positively related. So if given these two functions and you're asked to identify which one represents what, for the demand, a negative relationship should be portrayed between the two variables, quantity and the price. For the supply, there should be a positive relationship between the quantity and the price. Now, how do we identify the demand a function and supply function on a graph. We did this in our last class. You can come up with a small table where price will be related to the quantity. You have even done this one as part of the assignment. You can set a price of shillings 10. How much will be the quantity? Of course, this will be 10. The price of, say, shillings 5, the quantity would go up to 15 units. And then you can come and plot this to constitute a straight line. Also, for the quantity supplied, you can rate it to the price. You can set a price of shillings 10. How much would be the quantity? If you put 10 shillings here, you would have 15 units. Assuming the price is at shillings 5, it's good to go for the same prices since you're drawing this on the same Cartesian plane. If you put shillings 5 here, you'd have a quantity of how much? 0 units. This would be 15 minus 15, 0. And then on a graphical representation, you want to plot these two together. Quantity on the X, remember, with the price to be plotted on the Y, according to the rules for graphical representation, remember. So you can just stick to the two prices you have used in your analysis of the quantities. The price of shillings 5 and 10, you don't need a scale there. Then the quantities, of course, again, we are dealing with about 3 units here, 0 unit, 10 units, and 15. So again, I can go for a range of 5, 5, maybe 5 there, 10, maybe 15. That is enough. You can even spread it to accommodate a lot of space there onto your right. So at a price of shillings 10, we have 10 units here. When you substitute 10 for P in our first equation here, somewhere there. The price of shillings 5, we have 15 units. You can extend, 2 points are enough to draw a straight line. Remember, this is a linear function. You're using a ruler to join your points. Mine may not be exact straight line, but you can see it's not so far away from a straight line. You can extend it to either side, even to cut your x-axis, it's still okay. Even to cut the y-axis, it's still okay. This is our demand curve, the DD. Then at a price of shillings 5, we have 0 units, some are here. Then at a price of shillings 10, we have about 15 units. 15 units is somewhere here. You come and plot that. You can include other prices if you want. And then you're joining, your supply curve is supposed to go through the origin, the 0, 0 coordinate. Of course, again, you're using a ruler to join your points. So you have your supply curve represented there. Then at the point of intersection, you come and identify the equilibrium point. You approximate what price is going to give rise to what quantity. So you can talk of a price of around shillings. This approximation could be around shillings 8 or 8 shillings and 50 cents, somewhere there. around 8.5 or 9, depending on your accuracy. This is slightly higher than 11, maybe 11.5 or 12. Remember, as we said, this is a graphical representation. We are likely to have a small change in between the quantity and the price when we do our estimations. If we were to go through the calculation way, method 2, that is method 1, when you represent your two linear functions on the same graph, and at the point of intersection, you are identifying the equilibrium point to give rise to both the equilibrium price. This is a P, and the equilibrium quantity here, in short, the QE units. It's not a must that one does the graphical representation. You can as well calculate the equilibrium price and the quantity from the two linear functions given. The first step is the condition for equilibrium. The condition for equilibrium is what? At equilibrium point, the condition is that demand for the commodity should actually equate to the supply. Okay? So you take your demand function, the demand function is the QD function. You equate this one to the supply function, the QS. And then, of course, you bring the right equations for the two functions. 20 minus P is our quantity demanded. We equate it to the quantity supplied as a function of price minus 15 plus 3P. Okay. You group the right terms together. Of course, you bring the price to one of the directions. Could it be the right or the left? Either way, it will still work. So we'll have 15 going to this other side. We'll have 35. We equate this one to the price. Taking it to the other side, you'll have 4P for that price. Then as you can see, we are solving for the P, making it the subject. We'll have 35 divided by 4. That is 5 divided by 4. That should give us a price of what? Let's see. If somebody has found that, you can indicate it on the chart. That is 8.75 as our equilibrium price. Shillings. So you can see this is not too far away from our estimation. We estimated a price of shillings 8.50, slightly less than what we have calculated, but we are within the estimation is okay for us. If a student had estimated a price of shillings 9, it's still okay. We are within the range of allowance provided for that. Then the question is, now that you have found the equilibrium price, how then do we determine the equilibrium quantity? Class, attention on this. Once you have found one of the variables, the price, for example, in our case, you will substitute the figure found in either, and I repeat, in either the demand function or the supply function to be able now to come up with the equilibrium quantity. I repeat, substitute the figure found in either the demand or supply function so that you now be able to identify the other variable. In our case, we are looking for the equilibrium quantity. And you should be able to get the same result, whether you use the demand or the supply function. So for me, to come up with the quantity demanded, which is the same as the quantity supplied, that is our QE now here, we can apply both the demand or supply. Let's use the demand first and we see what will be the result. We'll take 20, we minus P, stick to the function given. But now for us to come up with the QE, we should be substituting the PE in our function. 20 minus PE. Why did I substitute the P when I'm constituting the QE? Look at our graphical representation here. When price is at equilibrium point, we have the quantity known as the QE. They should go hand in hand. So to come up with our quantity here, we'll take the price so computed, which was coming to 8 shillings and 75 cents. We just subtract that. And this will give us an amount of, let's see, 11 units, 0.25. And as you can see again, from our estimate, we are within the range. We got 11.5 there, which is slightly less than 12. And our calculated figure is 11.25. So we are okay with that. How else can we find the quantity, whichever we are calling the equilibrium quantity? We can apply the supply function. Of course, you'll use one. There's no need for you to apply the two, but what if somebody had applied the supply function, which was given as minus 15 plus 3p. Again, for you to find the QE, the price prevailing in the market for this commodity should be at equilibrium point, minus 15 plus 3PE. You substitute the equilibrium price on your function, the quantity supplied function, okay? So you'll take negative 15, you add 3. Of course, here you're bringing the P, the price we had found of shillings 8 and 75 cents. That should give us what? Again, we have the same amount of 11 units, 0.25. And these two should actually be exactly the same. You find that there is a variation or there's a difference, then something is not okay with your workings. And of course, we're saying you can just stick to one, but remember to maintain accuracy, so that if somebody had applied the other function, the expectation is that you should have the same result at the end of the day. So we have learned that to come up with the equilibrium of a commodity in the market, there are two dimensions into which we can look at this. One is where from a SAGU, we are provided with a relationship existing between the price and the quantity, both on the demand and the supply. And by graphical representation, you should be able to read through the point of intersection where you estimate the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. Again, if the demand and supply functions are taking the linear form, one can be able to still plot the two functions on a graph and remember the same graph. And at the point of intersection, you still be able to identify the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. Then through the calculation, the condition for equilibrium is that demand must equate to supply. So bring the two equations, you relate them, whereby you'll be able to identify one of the variables and you substitute the figure so found in either the demand or supply functions to come up with the other variable. For us, we started by looking at the P, the equilibrium price, which has helped us now to identify the equilibrium quantity by using either the demand or the supply function. So I hope that is clear on how to come up with the demand at equilibrium, also the supply at equilibrium, and also the equilibrium price. In short, to identify the market equilibrium for a commodity and under normal circumstances, where we are saying to identify the equilibrium for a commodity in the market, we have got no economic forces existing in the market. So with that, let's now look at the disequilibrium in the market for a commodity. Okay, what is market disequilibrium? First of all, I take you back a little bit to the definition of the market equilibrium. We have said this is a state of rest or a state of balance in which the demand and supply for a commodity are equal, and therefore there exist no economic forces to offset the situation in the market for a commodity. That the two forces are actually the same, no force that is more than the other. We normally say there is the state of balance. Not all the times in the market for a commodity that demand would equate to supply. Many are the instances when those two are not the same. And of course, this is the most occurring situation in the market for a particular commodity. What do we mean by that? The market disequilibrium would be as a result of what we call the economic forces. This occurs due to the presence of economic forces. What are these economic forces we are talking of? We have got two economic forces that may exist in the market for a commodity. One is what we call the excess demand and also the excess supply. I repeat, economic forces may be either, of course, they have to be one at a time, either excess demand or excess supply. Excess demand or excess supply. And let's deal with each one at a time. We understand what is the meaning of these two forces. Okay, and I'll start by looking at the excess demand. What is excess demand? Excess demand occurs when demand is more than the supply of the commodity in the market. This is an economic force which occurs when demand for the commodity in the market exceeds the supply. The question is, if demand or what is being demanded by the consumers is more than what the suppliers have provided in the market for a given commodity, our problem is what will happen to the market for that commodity? Okay. What is excess supply, on the other hand, as an economic force? Excess supply would occur as an economic force when it's a situation when the supply of the commodity in the market is actually more than the demand. Are there situations where supplier has brought in more quantity than what is being demanded by the users of the product? There could be such a situation. The question is again, or our problem is to identify if supply is exceeding demand, what would be the implication of that? To illustrate the result of these two forces, if either of them were to exist in the market, I'll consider a graphical representation here. We have the quantity and we have the price. On a graphical representation, again, we represent both the demand curve and the supply curve. Demand sloping downwards, supply curve sloping upwards. At the point of intersection, we have the equilibrium point, giving rise to both the equilibrium quantity and the equilibrium price. Of course, you make it more straight, not like mine. Assuming the market that has been set by the market forces, the price set by the market forces, sorry. Let's call it price P1 here. Could be shillings 5 per unit or whichever the price. Let's see the implication of this price. From the law of supply, we know the lower the price, the lower the quantity supplied in the market. Let's assume we are now offering quantity Q1 units in the market for sale. But on the other hand, look at this class. The price prevailing in the market is attracting so many consumers the demand is high for that commodity in the market. Reason, the price is much more affordable by most people. To this consumer, he could be willing now to purchase all the way to Q4 units of the commodity in the market. As you can see now, there exists a difference in between. There's a difference between the quantity demanded and of course the quantity supplied in the market for this commodity. This difference is what we call, look at this, the amount demanded at Q1, at Q4, sorry, the amount supplied at Q1 units. The demand is overwhelming whatever has been supplied in the market. This is what I can call the excess demand. Up here with me in my illustration class, excess demand. Whatever has been demanded at that price of shillings P1 is actually more than what we have supplied in the market. So we talk of an economic force known as excess demand. Q4 units demanded are more than the Q1 units supplied. What are the implications of an excess demand in the market for a commodity? With excess demand, of course, you'd expect this price P1 will start to increase. That's the normal behavior in the market for a commodity, that when we are demanding more than what has been supplied, the supplier will take an opportunity now of increasing the price of the commodity in the market. Look at the rush hours, for example, when every other person wants to go back home. Demand is higher than the supply of the vehicles available in the market, which means demand will be pushing the price level upwards. So by definition class, we can say this. An excess demand is an economic force which exerts an upward pressure on the price of the commodity in the market under normal circumstances, which exerts an upward pressure in the price or on the price of the commodity in the market, but again, under normal circumstances. I'm quoting normal circumstances because we'll see again a case where we may be having the government intervention. So with excess demand, price starts now to go up. Let's see the behavior by both the consumer and the supplier of the commodity during the time price starts to increase. Of course, with an increase in the price level, P1 being pushed towards the P, the price will make the supplier now to start increasing on the supply. You see, as the price increases, you'd expect the supplier to start increasing on the quantity. But on the other hand, the commodity is becoming, could be expensive to the consumer, but I say expensive in quotes because this is relative. The consumer now starts to decline on the quantity demanded. You see, with an increase in price, if you are to go by this graph, the curve for the DD shows that the quantity will now start to go down. This may happen to a point where the two may actually become the same, and again we restore back the equilibrium position. If that happens, we can call such a situation a stable equilibrium in the market for the commodity. I repeat, with an excess demand as an economic force, the price will start to increase, or the excess demand will exert a pressure on the price level. With an increase in the price of the commodity, the quantity supplied will now start to go down, to increase. You can see there'll be an experience of an increase in the supply in the market for the commodity. But on the other hand, the consumer will now start experiencing high price, so he'll decline on the quantity demanded. The two may happen that they are now the same, increase in supply, decline in the quantity demanded, okay? The equilibrium for this commodity may be restored back, and such, we can talk about a stable equilibrium. Okay, let's look at what we mean by the excess supply. I will assume in the market for our commodity here, the price prevailing is price P2. I've used a different color so that it is much more feasible. Price P2, let's see the implication of it in the market. The quantity demanded for this commodity could be at around Q2 units. Say 20 units or whichever the amount. On the other hand, the supply is being attracted by an increase in the price. You can see it's higher now to offer a larger quantity in the market for sale. I will assume all the way to Q3 units. If the prevailing market price as set by the market forces is price P2, the consumer will demand a lower quantity, let's assume quantity Q2 units. On the other hand, being a higher price, it will attract more supply of the commodity, say all the way to Q3 units. There exists a difference, as you can see, between the price and the quantity, between the demand, and the supply. And this difference is what we can call the excess supply. The difference between demand and supply being more than demand, we can call this one the excess supply. Now that there is an excess supply, what will happen in the market for this commodity? Excess supply by definition occurs when a larger quantity has been offered in the market for a commodity than what is being demanded in the market. Meaning, as an economic force, since we want to do away with excess supply or with excess stocks, the supplier would be willing to lower the price level of this commodity. Of course, you don't want to have everything, if it's, say, a perishable commodity going bad, that you have losses incurred, you'd rather sell it at a throwaway price. So price will start coming down. So as an excess supply, we say it is an economic force which exerts a downward pressure on the price of the commodity in the market. Meaning, price will now start to go down. And let's see the implication of a decline in the price level of this commodity. If starts to come down, the quantity demanded, as you can see, will now start to increase. On the other hand, as a supplier, you're fearing of losses with a lower price, so you'll start declining on the quantity as supplied in the market. These two, again, with an increase in demand, with a decline in the supply, may meet at some point where they'll be the same, and so we can say the condition for equilibrium will be established when demand and supply are the same, meaning they will actually have restored back the equilibrium position. Again, an example of what we call a stable equilibrium. A stable equilibrium is a situation where in the market for a commodity class, the economic forces, either an excess demand or an excess supply, whenever they exist in the market for the commodity, there will be a restoration of the equilibrium back to its original position. I repeat, a stable equilibrium occurs when, with the presence of an economic force, could be an excess supply or an excess demand, the equilibrium position may be restored back to its original position. So that is what we call disequilibrium in the market for a commodity. And I've stated this class, a disequilibrium occurs when demand, the condition for disequilibrium is that demand for the commodity in the market does not equate to supply. They are not the same. Okay. And if they are not the same, it means either demand is more than supply, an economic force known as excess demand, which if it happens, it exerts an upward pressure on the price level of the commodity in the market, okay? An excess supply will occur as an economic force when the supply is more than demand. And if that is the case, it would mean that the excess supply will force the price level downwards. It is an economic force which exerts a downward pressure on the price of the commodity. If assuming any one of these two forces exist in the market for the commodity, excess supply or even excess demand, and that prices are being pushed towards the equilibrium price to a point where the equilibrium point is being restored back to its original position, that is what we call a stable equilibrium. Of course, an unstable equilibrium would occur if the prices were being pulled far away from the equilibrium or at price, and so will not be able to restore back the equilibrium position to where it was. For such an unstable equilibrium, if you remember, we covered some exceptional cases to the law of demand and also to the law of supply. If we have the equilibrium here between the price and the quantity, we have potency, the demand function and the supply function. Assuming here we have the exceptional cases to the law of demand and to the law of supply. If you remember, we talked about a backward bending supply curve of labor, for example, as an abnormal supply curve, okay? We also talked about a progressive demand curve, still an abnormal demand curve. We talked about exceptional cases such as the ostentatious goods, the given goods, and so on. If our equilibrium point is somewhere here between demand and supply, of course, this would be our equilibrium quantity, the equilibrium price here. I'm demonstrating an unstable equilibrium, this being the price PE. Say we have a price prevailing in the market here at a price of shillings P2 or some 20 shillings, say so. Then here we have a price prevailing in the market, assuming price P1 or shillings 10. The implication of price P1 is what? This would be our excess what class? This being supply, this being demand. This would actually talk about excess supply. There'll be an excess supply here. Let me call it ES. And we have said under normal circumstances, okay, an excess supply, whenever it exists in the market, it pushes the price level downward. So you can see now, we are kind of pulling the price P1 far, far away from the equilibrium price. The price P1 will start declining, which means it will not go near to the price PE, and there is no way to which this equilibrium can be restored back. The same, assuming the prevailing market price here is price P2, the implication of this in the market for our commodity is that there is an excess demand. You can see the quantity demanded will be more here than the quantity supplied here. So to talk about the excess demand, let me call it ED. Excess demand, we have said, is an economic force which does what? it actually exerts an upward pressure on the price. So price will be pulled far, far away from the equilibrium price, PE here. As it increases, the PE as it increases, it will be pulled far, far away from the PE. And there's no way to which we are able to restore back our equilibrium position to where it was. So by definition, how would one define an unstable equilibrium? An unstable equilibrium occurs in the market when, with the presence of economic forces, either an excess demand or an excess supply, the prevailing market prices are pulled far, far away from the equilibrium price, and the equilibrium point is not restored back to its original position. That is how we may define an unstable equilibrium, different from what we have called a stable equilibrium. Hope that is clear. In some instances, we do have what we call government intervention. Of course, we are talking of price controls in regards to setting prices of some commodities. Some, I'm not talking of all, certain commodities in the market for a commodity. So I'm going to introduce slightly the concept of price controls. This is a government intervention, because not always that the price of a commodity will be set and controlled by the market forces. Market forces are the excess demand and the excess supply that you have talked about in the determination of the prevailing market price for a particular commodity in the market. So again, I've shared another concept here called the price controlled, and would first of all want to understand what exactly do we mean by this term. Of course, this is a situation where we are not letting the forces of the demand and supply take control in the market for a given commodity. And therefore, we define price controls as an artificial situation where the government would intervene and set the price, of course, control it for a particular commodity in the market, but guided by the rules and the regulations set in the country. So price control would say it's the government's intervention into setting the price of a commodity in the market through the registrations already defined in the country. And of course, it's not for all the commodities where the price will be regulated by the government. There are circumstances under which the government may consider to set the price of a commodity in the market. So we are seeing a situation where we have moved far away from letting the price being freely determined by the market forces, and there's some intervention where there could be a reason behind price controls. We have got two types of price controls. Number one is what we call a maximum price control. Also known as a price ceiling. And this is that price, the highest to which a commodity would experience in the market, usually set by the government. And this maximum price, if you are a supplier of a commodity whose price is being set by the government as a maximum price, the product cannot be sold beyond this particular price. Usually set by the government, when the government feels that the price that we were talking of as determined by the market forces, the PE, is actually very high. If that is the situation, then the price set by the government would help to lower that which has been set by the market forces, usually to benefit people who cannot be able to afford the commodity in the market. A good example, look at the education by the state-sponsored students. As much as they study, for example, at our college, which is a private institution, the tuition fee is determined by the government. We can't charge more than what the government has said. Reason, as far as the public education is concerned, or that which is provided by the state, we have got so many people in our society who cannot afford the private tuition, and therefore the government sees that whatever has been set by the market forces is too high. Let's regulate this by setting an affordable fee by most students in our country. Therefore, a maximum price control is a price set by the government, okay, on a certain commodity through which the seller or the dealer of that product cannot sell it beyond that price as put in by the government. It occurs when the price that was set by the market forces, by the feel by the government, it was too high, and therefore the government set a relatively lower price so that majority can be able to afford the commodity. Another major scenario into which the government may go for the maximum price control is a case where the nation could be experiencing something like inflation. Inflation, as we rate around C, it's one of our topics to go by, is a situation in the country where the prices of goods and services are persistently increasing. They are actually too high. And so by the feel by the government, you may find majority are not able to cope up with such high prices. Therefore, the government may regulate this price by setting a maximum price control, such a way majority can now be able to afford the commodity in the market. So to do away with the high rate of inflation, one of the things that the government may consider to do in the nation is by setting a maximum price control. So that is what we can call maximum price control, also acting as a ceiling. Why as a ceiling is because we can't sell the product to which the government has set a maximum price beyond that price in the market for the commodity. So that is a major reason as to why we call it a ceiling in the market. Okay. Number 2 is what we call a minimum price. And of course, as we talk of the maximum, before I go to the minimum, there are so many other circumstances that the government may feel we really need to go for the maximum price control. Like maybe we want to promote our productions in the country where people would be like discouraged from buying the important commodities. If let's say we go to a shop where we see the price has been set by the government as a relatively lower price and we can afford that which is being produced locally, of course we'll go for it. And by so doing, we are supporting our local infant industries, and we might realize growth and development in our industries through the maximum prices that the government may be setting for some commodities in the market. Our number 2 and the other circumstances, again, reaching to maximum price control, being a measure taken by the government in the country. Number 2 is what we call the minimum price control. And we can also call this one a price floor. And this is a situation where you remember we had a price called the P, which was set by the market forces. If the government feels that that price, which was set by the forces of demand and supply, was too low, yeah, the government's intervention would be with the name of making that price to be relatively high. I repeat, if the price set by the market forces of demand and supply is too low by the government, then the price we are calling minimum price will be set with the name of making such a price to be relatively high. Therefore, it is a price acting as a floor. Why? Because we cannot sell the product below that price. Basically, this price will be aimed at helping like those particular producers whose prices are very low in the market for their products. The government may wish to support them. If your commodity is fetching a poor price, to help have an increase in the price of such a commodity, the government may consider a minimum price control. Another good scenario is like what happens in our country, Labor Day. One of the main reasons as to why people attend such a function as held by the government is actually to hear of a change on the minimum wage. We hear of a certain industry that every other worker working in such organization, the lowest pay should be 20,000. Of course, this is to help to boost the living standards by the people in the country, that they are able to afford the goods and services. One of the arguments why we go for a push on the pay is because of the cost of living being high in the country. So the government may call for industries to pay their workers a certain minimum wage or salary, upon which they can now be able to afford a number of their wants in the society. And this is a charge already indicated by the government, or an amount indicated by the government, to which you shouldn't be paying your workers below that particular wage. Or if it's a price for the commodity, then we should not charge a lower price for that commodity. Of course, there are some implications in regards to each one of these price controls. Because when it comes to, say, you're a producer, for example, and you are forced to charge a lower price for your product. What are the implications, assuming you had already produced and the price for the materials you are using, or in general, the cost of production was high and that price cannot meet that cost? What happens? There may be some who will not be able to survive in the industry in the name of very low price for the product, not being able to realize the profits targeted, for example, by the suppliers or the producers in the market. This may mean quitting the industry, for example. And of course, shortages are going to become chronic, or they prevail in the market for the commodity in the name of some moving out of the business. Because if the price is not a guarantee for you to even cater for the cost, say you're incurring losses, if it is in the long run period, as you later on see when you get to the production theory, because there's a period of time you cannot quit the industry. But if it's the long run, somebody may decide to walk away and maybe to try other avenues where maybe prices are not controlled by the government. And the same happens to the minimum price controls. A good scenario is through the wage, say, as indicated by the government, you cannot keep on paying your workers as per the demands raised by the government. You may resort into incurring huge cost of production through the cost of labor. And by so doing, one may fail with the losses incurred. I cannot survive in this, so you may decide to again walk away. And in the name of that, we will suffer in the country because we'll realize some shortages, unemployment levels will be high, levels of earnings being low would mean less in terms of investment. So there are some implications. As much as we said there are some goodies to account to the price controls, also we have some other negative results in relation to this. Based on this now, your exercise for today, which I'll update you on this, you'll actually give out the advantages and the disadvantages. In a nutshell, you're trying to look at the effects brought in by what we call the maximum price controls, as well as the minimum price controls. You look at that during your free time. The opposite of price controls class is what we call price decontrols. What is a price decontrol? Also referred to in some books, you may find this discussed as under price liberalization. This is a situation where you see we had a price control for the commodity. There was an intervention such a way the price was no longer to be set and controlled by the market forces of demand and supply. And when the governments walk away now to leave the price free to be determined by the market forces, we talk about a price decontrol. So price decontrol is a form of transition in which that price for a commodity which was set by the government and of course regulated by the government is now left free. To be liberal means to be free. Is left free to be regulated and also to be set by the market forces of demand and supply. So we are going back to where we started this morning, the concept of equilibrium for a commodity in the market, where price was actually determined by the market forces for both demand and also supply. So when we are talking of a price decontrol, we are stating this is a form of transition into which the price of a commodity is set free to be regulated by the market forces of demand and supply. We are moving from a state where the government was setting and controlling the price of a commodity, now to be set and controlled by the free forces of demand and supply. My question, and again your exercise for today: what are the advantages and of course disadvantages of this concept of equilibrium, or rather the market equilibrium concept? What are the advantages and the disadvantages of what we can call the work of price mechanism, where we are letting the price to be set and controlled by the free forces of demand and supply? As you do your exercise, try to relate to what you did under the free market society, where there were no government intervention as an assumption, such as there was no something like a price control, and so prices of the different commodities in the market were to be regulated by the free forces of demand and supply. So you evaluate that during your free time. We stop there for today. I can take a few questions, if any, in regards to today's presentation.